It all started with an unusual call to the phone of a journalist named Max. As always busy, he was in a hurry to complete his report that day and was about to leave when he suddenly received a call from an anonymous source. The stranger on the other end of the line was speaking haltingly but confidently. "Max, do you know what's going on in an abandoned house on the outskirts? No matter what you think, just go there. You can't pass it by." The journalist reacted with doubt to the words of the anonymous person. Abandoned houses were not uncommon in the area, where several buildings remained dilapidated and completely unattended after the financial crisis. However, the stranger's tone was insistent, as if he knew something, and moreover, he was able to convince. Already late in the evening, after a busy day at work, Max accepted this strange invitation, deciding that in the worst case, he would simply return with nothing. The next day, when he went to the place, he took with him only a camera, a notebook, and a flashlight, deciding that in a few hours he would be able to explore the house and check what was so interesting there. He did not know that this report would turn into a nightmare for him. The house stood on the edge of a quiet street, surrounded by a forest, and now it seemed even more frightening. The windows were boarded up, but dim light filtered through the cracks. Someone was clearly trying to hide what was happening inside, but with minimal effort. When Max got closer, he noticed that the door was ajar, as if it was waiting for him. A light draft was blowing from somewhere inside, urging him to come in. Everything inside was covered with a layer of dust. There was a musty smell in the air, which caused a slight dizziness, but Max, trying not to lose concentration, turned on the flashlight and began to carefully inspect the room. At first glance, there is nothing unusual: the remains of furniture, several discarded boxes, and books lying around. However, his attention was soon attracted by the stairs leading to the attic. The steps were covered with stains that at first seemed to him to be traces of rust, but on closer inspection they looked more like dried blood. Max felt growing uneasiness, but professional interest forced him to move on. He ventured up the stairs and heard a faint sound, like the creaking of an old board, or maybe a distant whisper. When he got up, he saw an attic with only a few boxes and old dusty furniture. Nothing particularly remarkable, except for one thing: there was a small doll lying among all this junk. It looked relatively new and clearly did not fit the rest of the things that seemed to have been forgotten for a long time. Max slowly approached her and noticed that someone had carved something on the doll's forehead. The text was indecipherable, but the letters looked sloppy and hurried, as if the person wrote them in a hurry or in a state of great excitement. Trying to understand the meaning of the inscription, he turned on the camera, taking several pictures for further analysis. It was only when he came back down that he noticed another detail. In the corner of the room, strange lines and symbols resembling primitive drawings were painted on the wall, and something about their shape seemed familiar to him, as if he had seen it before in one of his past investigations. He had previously found echoes of these symbols in records of cult rituals left by long-abandoned communities. All this did not fit into my head. Before Max could sort out his own thoughts, he heard a sound that startled him. Someone was walking slowly through the house. The sound came from the direction of the corridor and was approaching. Max, holding his breath, felt a growing fear. It took him a split second to realize that someone had been watching him all this time. Max instinctively reached for the switch on the camera, but decided to leave it on. It is unknown what might be useful in the future. He pressed himself against the wall, trying not to make a sound, and listened. Silence. It seemed that the footsteps he had just heard were a figment of his imagination. However, a slight, barely audible rustle sounded again, as if someone was pulling a piece of cloth or rubber across the floor, and each time the sound got a little closer. Max slowly moved around the corner and pointed the flashlight in the direction of the sound. A dim light cut through the darkness, but there was no one in the hallway. He looked around again, feeling a chill run through his body. A dim light flashed on the stairs below, as if someone had opened the door to the street for a moment, and then slammed it again. The journalist had an uneasy feeling that the way back might be blocked. Trying not to panic, Max decided to go around all the rooms on the ground floor. As soon as he stepped into the next room, he noticed that one of the walls was covered with chalk marks, as if someone was making notches. Next to these lines were a few words written in uneven, tenacious letters. "I'm here. No one hears." Max took photos of the inscriptions, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Strangely, they reminded him of the recent news. The police were looking for a man who had disappeared in the area several months ago, but no trace was found. While Max was examining the inscriptions, his gaze fell on one of the doors. It was slightly ajar and, as if inviting him, creaked when he touched it. He entered a small room, barely illuminated by the streetlight. There was almost no furniture here, except for an old desk, on which lay a pile of yellowed sheets of paper. They were notes written hastily, in places in scribbles, and sometimes in small, neat letters. Max collected them all to study in more detail. On some of the sheets there was a diary describing someone's feeling of anxiety, despair, and incomprehensible expectation. "They're watching," one of the pages said, "but no one notices." Max turned the sheet over and saw the last lines. "I can't leave. Something is keeping me from leaving this house." He had a vague suspicion that the author of the notes was the missing person who had never been found. When Max left the room, he noticed that someone had placed small rags and rags in narrow rows, as if creating some kind of system of labels or designations. He saw bloodstains on one of the old handkerchiefs. Now his thoughts were getting darker and darker. Why had Anonymous asked him to come here? And what was he hoping to find? Max decided it was time to leave. He took quick steps towards the exit, but when he reached the stairs, he realized that the door he had left ajar was now tightly closed. He pulled on the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if someone had locked her in from the outside. Max turned around abruptly and, panic-stricken, rushed back into the depths of the house in search of another exit. Ahead, he saw another door leading to the basement, and, finding no other way, decided to go downstairs. The basement was full of trash and old tools, but something else caught his attention. A rusty crate standing in the corner. Max came closer and opened it. There was a notebook with photos inside. He began to flip through the pages, and the further he read, the more tense he became. The photos showed people who looked like they were alive, but scared. Many of the pictures were taken in different parts of the house. This can't be true, he thought, but then the last entry caught his attention. It showed the place where he was now. The caption under the photo read, "Journalist." Max closed his notebook in a panic and rushed to the basement exit, but he had barely taken a few steps when he heard a knock behind him. He looked around, expecting to see something terrible, but all he saw was an old fan that had apparently turned on its own. My heart was pounding, but I had only one thought: I need to find a way out. After a few agonizing minutes, making his way through the corridors, Max saw a small window at the end of the room. The window looked big enough to fit through, and after breaking the glass with a flashlight, he got out, finally being free. He looked back at the house. There was a strange creaking sound, as if someone was rocking in a chair. Max, covered in cold sweat, ran down the street without looking back, only feeling with his back that this house would never forget him. Max ran down the dark street, looking over his shoulder, until he found himself in the lighted parking lot at the nearest gas station. The light of the lanterns seemed to be his salvation, and only there he finally stopped to catch his breath. With trembling hands, he took out his phone and checked the photos taken in the house. The pictures were clear, but with each new photo he became more and more anxious. A doll with letters carved on his forehead, mysterious inscriptions on the walls, a diary with notes about insane fear, and a photo with the caption "Journalist." This picture was especially disturbing. Max decided to return to the editorial office and prepare an article. He already had all the material: photographs, notes, personal impressions. He wanted to describe everything he saw, from strange symbols to creepy sounds. The only thing he didn't understand was why the anonymous person had sent him to that house. Whoever was behind this clearly had some idea of what was going on. Max began to suspect that the anonymous person could be a part of this story or even a witness to what happened to the missing people. Upon arrival at the editorial office, he immediately began to write an article. About an hour later, his phone rang again. An unknown number appeared on the screen. Reluctantly answering, Max heard the familiar voice of the anonymous person who sent him to an abandoned house. "How do you like the house?" A voice sounded, full of mockery and something subtle, disturbing. "Who are you? Why did you send me there?" Max tried to remain calm, but his voice was trembling treacherously. "You wanted to know the truth yourself, didn't you?" The other man laughed. "You saw what everyone should have seen." "What do you mean?" Max was almost shouting into the phone, but the anonymous voice had already disappeared. The call ended, leaving the journalist completely confused. A few days have passed. Max returned to his daily duties, although the story of the house haunted him. He tried to send the article to print, but the editor unexpectedly refused to publish it. "Listen, Max, this is not exactly the material we need," the editor said, choosing his words. "It looks like a fiction. It will cause a scandal." Max did not understand why the editor, who always supported his articles, refused to print the material. In the evening, when he was trying to revise the article again, a letter arrived at the editorial office, a handwritten note without a return address. On the sheet it was written, "You don't think you're going to get rid of this so easily, do you? You've seen more than you should have." A black and white photograph was attached to the note. The photo showed the same abandoned house, but only a face was clearly visible in the window on the second floor. His own face. Max froze, looking at the picture. He knew that someone had been watching him all this time. The next day, Max decided to take back control of the situation. He went to see his colleague, a retired detective, with whom he had long maintained friendly relations. Dan, experienced and knowledgeable, was the only person Max could trust with this story. "So you think it's not just an accident?" Dan asked, studying the photos and notes. "Maybe whoever sent you there really didn't want you to get out." Max nodded. He told Dan about the strange calls and the note with the photo. The detective listened attentively, and then, considering the situation, offered to return to the house together. Max hesitated, but the feeling that he had to get to the truth was stronger than fear. The next evening, the two of them arrived at the house. Dan, who was used to such situations, opened the door and cautiously examined the room. They did not find any traces of human presence. All the items were in their places, but one thing alerted them both. The room where Max found the notes looked a little different. The table and chair were moved, and a new inscription appeared on the wall. "You won't know the whole truth anyway." Suddenly, footsteps were heard again somewhere above. Dan motioned for Max to follow him, and they cautiously headed for the attic. When they got up, they saw an old chest that Max had not noticed before. Dan was the first to approach the chest and, after giving it a suspicious look, slowly opened the lid. There were strange things inside. Several dusty, yellowed photographs with images of those who, apparently, were the last residents of the house, a thick stack of handwritten notes, and an object that immediately caught Max's eye, an old dictaphone with a cassette inside. Without hesitation, Max took out his dictaphone and pressed the play button. The tape rustled, and then a voice rang out in the silence. Deep, hoarse, sounding like someone's appreciative monologue. "Do you know how it is? There are no walls in the house, but whole lives are locked up. And these lives, they won't go away. They're always here, you just don't see them. They don't want you to know that they're locked up. They did everything they could to keep us here. Just like you are now. This house doesn't let anyone out just like that." Max gripped the recorder tighter, his hands shaking. He glanced at Dan, but Dan also seemed to sense that something was wrong. But at that moment, a slight crackling sound came from the speaker and, finally, a long, eerily calm whisper. "Those who come here are already part of this place. And you're the new witness. You are the last witness." When they finished listening, Max and Dan left the trunk open and quickly headed for the exit. They were both uneasy, but the sense of danger was too acute to linger. After walking a few steps down the corridor, they heard the creak of the old floor behind them. Turning around, Max noticed how the door to the room where they had just been slammed shut on its own. "We're leaving now," Dan said, and they quickened their pace. When they reached the front door, another unexpected surprise awaited them. There was a shadow in the doorway, like a man who seemed to be waiting for them. Without hesitation, Dan took off and opened the door, and they ran out into the street without looking back. However, it didn't end there. The next morning, when Max returned home, he received another letter. This time it was a small envelope without signatures. Inside was a photo of her and Dan, taken in the same style as the previous one, black and white, slightly blurred. In this picture, they were standing in the very room they had run out of the night before, with empty, almost lifeless expressions on their faces. Max froze in disbelief. How could someone have filmed them from such close proximity? He felt something collapse inside him. He put the photo on the table and covered his face with his hands. Now he knew that no matter how far he went, no matter how hard he tried to forget this house, his presence remained with him forever. Frank Newman was an ordinary man leading a simple, measured life. There was nothing special about his habits. Work, a small circle of friends, rare trips to nature. Calm, even a little introverted, he always tried to stay away from any risk. His life proceeded in a routine, monotonous rhythm, and probably everything would have continued like this if it hadn't been for the tragedy that occurred in the spring. That day, he was going on a weekend trip, the first time in a long time that he decided to leave the city. He was waiting for her with a rare excitement for him. He wanted to distract himself, change the situation, and just see how people live in other places. But the trip was suddenly cancelled. The night before, a call informed him that an accident had occurred. Two of his colleagues who worked with him on a previous project had been found dead in their apartment. The police did not disclose details, and only one short news report indicated that the death occurred under strange circumstances. Frank was stunned, but did not yet suspect that this was just the beginning of a series of events that would gradually destroy his quiet life. A couple of days after the tragedy, he was called to a police interview to clarify the details of a work project in which he participated with the victims. Frank found himself in the office of Detective Ellison, a dry, gloomy, middle-aged man who asked the same questions several times. "Did you know that their behavior has changed in recent months?" the detective asked, glaring at him. Episodes flashed through Frank's memory. One of his colleagues started having trouble sleeping, the other became irritable and nervous. It was blamed on stress, a common thing in their field, but at that moment Frank began to think that not everything was so simple. Frank tossed and turned for a long time that night, thinking about what had happened. He began to have a strange feeling, as if someone was watching him, despite the empty apartment. The following week, he learned from colleagues that the victims had had panic attacks in recent days. They talked about strange noises at night and the feeling that someone was watching them. It left him confused. Why didn't anyone pay attention to their complaints? Why did they die at exactly the same time? Frank became more and more withdrawn, tormented by thoughts of what this case was hiding. It's been a few weeks. Returning home one day after a night shift, he decided to take a little rest before going back to work. But something strange happened that night. He woke up in the middle of the night, barely falling asleep, and couldn't bring himself to fall asleep again. All he could hear was his own breathing echoing in the silence, as if there was something alien somewhere very close by, something that was bothering him. His condition worsened every day. He began to wake up in a cold sweat, lying on the sweat-soaked sheets, feeling an inexplicable fear cover him. Sometimes he woke up with the feeling that someone was imperceptibly breathing on his face, standing next to him and disappearing the moment he opened his eyes. In the last week of insomnia, When Frank was almost losing track of time, he had a clear idea that he might face the same problems as his dead colleagues. Frank began to avoid sleeping at night. It seemed to him that if he fell asleep, he would wake up in fear or not wake up at all. He stopped going to work, focusing only on staying up at night. His face was haggard, dark circles under his eyes treacherously indicated a prolonged sleepless state, but he did not want to share this with anyone. His life turned into an endless series of nights and days that merged into a single painful expectation. One day, while sitting at home watching videos, he came across a documentary about similar cases of insomnia and unexplained fear that overtakes victims just at night. It was about a rare disorder that affects people in moments of severe stress, which gradually leads to the fact that a person is afraid to fall asleep, no matter what happens to him. Frank recognized himself in the symptoms described: paranoia, the feeling that he was being watched, auditory and visual hallucinations, plunging him into a state of panic. But the most frightening thing was that in some cases this disorder turned out to be irreversible. Overwhelmed by the new information, he tried to find contacts of those who survived such episodes, but everywhere he found only mentions of the deaths of people who could not find a way out of this horror. Frank contacted Detective Ellison, the only one who knew the details of the case of the dead colleagues. When they met, he asked if the police had any information about the strange symptoms they had experienced before their deaths. Ellison must have suspected something was wrong for a long time, because he answered without hesitation. They were all afraid to sleep. One of them left a diary where he described waking up every night with the feeling that he was being strangled. Frank turned pale. He was experiencing the same symptoms himself. For several more weeks he avoided sleep, living in a state of constant terror. He was almost certain that once he fell asleep, he would suffer the same fate as his colleagues. One night, unable to stand any more paranoia and fatigue, he passed out right at the table. The dream, if it could be called that, fell on him with all its weight. His body seemed to be paralyzed, his arms and legs became motionless, and watching the darkness around him, he felt a strange weight fall on him. Frank was sure that this was the beginning of the end. When he woke up, he felt a sticky cold. His room was empty, but something had changed. The shadows seemed longer, as if they were stretching towards him, eagerly stretching towards him. He couldn't figure out if this was reality or the fruit of his exhausted mind. Frank went to a psychiatrist, hoping to find an explanation. The doctor diagnosed severe night terror syndrome. He was prescribed strong sedatives and advised to return to a normal routine. Frank started treatment, but even powerful drugs did not bring the long-awaited relief. The horror of the nights grew stronger, and the familiar walls of his apartment seemed to shrink like a vice. He woke up every night with a new thought that something was obviously wrong. All the medications caused him either severe weakness or nightmares so realistic that sometimes he could not distinguish them from reality. Walking down the corridor to the bathroom in one of these nightmares, he suddenly froze in horror. A man with a crazy expression on his face, haggard, with inflamed eyes, was looking at him from the reflection in the mirror. Frank was amazed at the extent to which he had already changed. It was easier during the day, but as soon as evening came, the tension returned. After several nights of fear, he had already stopped distinguishing between reality and his own illusions. Frank began to look for any ways to distract himself. He spent hours reviewing the news, reading books and articles, and studying forums where people described similar conditions. Among them were mentions of something very similar. Dozens of people described almost identical symptoms: sleep paralysis, frightening hallucinations, fear of what happens at night. Many, like him, were on the verge of despair, not knowing who else to turn to for help. One night, when he was completely exhausted, there was a knock on his door. The thought flashed through his head: who could it be at this hour? As he struggled to the door, he saw Allison on the threshold. The detective looked no better than Frank himself. His eyes were empty and gloomy. "Frank," he began quietly, "we have more information about your colleague's case." Ellison said that the police studied the last weeks of their lives and found a strange common feature. They were all trying to get rid of sleep. Someone took stimulants, Someone even set himself an alarm clock every half hour to prevent himself from falling into a deep sleep. At some point, they became obsessed with the idea of avoiding sleep at all costs. The reason was a feeling of constant surveillance and paranoia, which, according to them, arose only at night. Frank listened, unable to tear himself away. Ellison said that the day before their deaths, they began to keep a joint diary, where they recorded their feelings. This diary was the key to solving their fears. There they described similar dreams, dreams in which they found themselves in a windowless room, feeling that they could not move or even scream. They gasped and woke up in a cold sweat, with the feeling that someone was standing by their bed. Ellison handed Frank a copy of these notes, and he flipped through the pages in a mixture of fear and horror. Each entry was filled with panic, despair, and growing madness. What he saw coincided with his own feelings, and he realized that there was no turning back. Later, at home, he tried to sleep again. Taking the diary, he put it next to him, thinking that it would give him confidence. But as soon as he closed his eyes, images appeared in front of him, almost the same as those described in the diary. His body was paralyzed, and it was as if footsteps were heard in the room. It became unbearably heavy in his chest, and with every minute the feeling grew that if he did not wake up, he would remain in this nightmare forever. The first rays of dawn brought some relief, but Frank wasn't ready to face another night alone with his fear. Having decided to take extreme measures, he began to record his own feelings, as his colleagues did. It seemed to him that if he continued to keep records, he would be able to somehow structure his horror and find a way to get rid of it. He recorded every detail of the nights, the sounds, the paralysis, even the sensations when he got up in complete despair in the middle of the night. But every day his recordings became more chaotic and intermittent. Frank started avoiding mirrors and refused to go outside. It seemed that now his life was passing in a state of permanent night, where even the light did not give a sense of security. He began to notice strange things behind him. Movements in the corners of his vision, strange shadows, and, what was especially frightening, the feeling that someone was watching him. One evening, sitting in his kitchen, he realized that he could no longer fight. He was overwhelmed by the realization that his consciousness was already subordinated to fear, and even if he fell asleep, he would not wake up the same as before. Frank slowly ran his hand over his face, trying to stop the trembling, but it only got worse. It was as if he had fallen into an abyss from which there was no way out. Every night, his mind was torn apart, as if someone was deliberately pulling out his deepest fears and plunging him into them, leaving him no chance to rest. In desperation, Frank contacted Detective Ellison again, begging for a meeting. Ellison arrived quickly, as if he had already expected this call. He entered the apartment, looked around, and, noticing Frank's exhaustion, tried to cheer him up. But soon, seeing the condition of his friend, the detective himself looked worried. "I didn't want to tell you this, but," Ellison began, avoiding Frank's eyes. "We found something in the apartment of one of your colleagues, in the room where he spent his last days before." "Well, you know," Frank felt his hands go cold. "What did you find?" "Surveillance cameras. They were directed at his bed, at the windows, even at the entrance to the bathroom. According to the records, he hardly slept. Only short, anxious lapses into sleep, which were immediately followed by panic attacks. We don't know yet why he was doing it, but I think he was trying to find something. Or someone." Ellison paused, glancing at Frank before continuing. "You have to be prepared for the fact that it might not just be fear. Perhaps it's something that has already destroyed his consciousness. We checked the camera footage, and they show movement, but it's not clear where they're from. Maybe it's just a figment of his imagination, but if you decide, I can arrange a similar thing for you." Frank hesitated, but something inside him made him agree. He wanted to get rid of doubts, even if seeing the terrible with his own eyes was better than living in the unknown. Ellison brought the equipment the very next day and helped install the cameras. By evening, Frank already felt like he was in prison under surveillance, but a strange feeling of relief settled in his soul. Perhaps now he will find out what really happens at night. A few days have passed. Cameras recorded Frank tossing and turning, screaming in his sleep and sometimes getting up in the middle of the night, as if unconscious. But as soon as he woke up and sat down at his computer to watch the recordings, he was overcome with silent disappointment. Nothing. Just himself, trapped in a nightmare of his own fears. No sounds, no movements, just endless hours of his own terror. However, on the fourth night, he noticed something strange. In one of the recordings, Frank saw his own body suddenly begin to move in a way he had never done before. Muttering something barely audible, he gets out of bed, looks towards the camera and stops waiting. This moment seemed long, unbearable. He watched his own face, distorted by insomnia and fatigue, peering into the lens with some kind of painful interest. Then, as if waking up, he turns around and goes back to bed. Frank felt cold sweat trickle down his back. He was sure he had never done that. He was sure he had been asleep all night. Or didn't you sleep? The state could no longer be called wakefulness. His mind was wandering in a nightmare where he was hostage to his own fears. During the night, he woke up to a creepy sound coming from the hallway. A loud scratching sound, as if someone was trying to break through the walls. His hands were shaking involuntarily, but he decided to check, thinking it was just his imagination. However, the sound was real. It grew stronger and more assertive until it was replaced by silence. Frank felt his throat go dry. The silence was scarier than any sound. The next morning, he looked through the notes, again expecting to see nothing. But this time the camera in the hallway showed something terrible. Frank himself was standing in front of the wall, trying to tear it to cracks and blood with his own nails. He was looking straight ahead, as if he had heard something that required his actions, his attention. Suddenly, he realized that he would no longer be able to sleep, stay awake, or believe his own feelings. The next day, Frank realized that he had been in some kind of half-asleep nightmare for the past weeks, and decided to stop this horror at all costs. He came up with the idea to meet with the last specialist he had not yet visited, a well-known psychotherapist specializing in sleep disorders and hallucinations. Dr. Reynolds received him in his office, asking a lot of questions and watching his reactions with unusual interest. After an hour of conversation, Reynolds suggested Frank undergo an experimental procedure, something like hypnosis combined with sleep therapy. Frank, on the verge of despair, agreed. He settled comfortably on the couch, and the doctor began his procedure, soothing Frank with his voice. The doctor's words became quieter, and soon Frank was completely immersed in a relaxed state, losing touch with reality. When Frank opened his eyes, he found that he was not in the study, but in his own bedroom. The room was dimly lit, and it seemed unnaturally quiet. Confused, he got up from the bed and went to the door. When Frank opened it, he saw that he was not going out into the corridor of his apartment, but into the corridor of an unfamiliar room, which, apparently, was old, covered with a layer of dust and left unattended for years. He moved forward cautiously, feeling like every step was being watched. Dark rooms stretched past him, in each of which the shadows of his own nightmares seemed to flicker. In one room, he noticed a vision of Detective Ellison, who was looking in his direction with an eyebrow raised, and in another, the figures of his colleagues, who disappeared and reappeared like mirages. In fear, Frank looked back and realized that the corridor was closed, and the door from which he had left had disappeared. Suddenly, the lights came on in the room, and he heard a booming voice from a speaker in the ceiling. "Frank, you're in the project. It's part of the treatment that you weren't aware of." Frank froze. "What does this mean? Are you following me?" The voice continued, "This experiment is not simple. You and the other participants voluntarily signed up for it, even if you don't remember. Everything you saw was part of a simulation we created to study fear. You had a stronger reaction than the others. It turned out that the human mind is not really ready for such intense influences." He walked back to the wall, feeling his breath fail him. "What the hell? Why me? "Why all this?" The voice paused for a moment, and then rang out again, now with a hint of regret. "Your story will serve as a new level of experiment. You've shown yourself to be extremely resilient. We will continue until you reach a state close to the limit. But don't worry. We'll always have the opportunity to start over." Frank realized that he was just a subject in a large-scale program, an experiment that led him to this state. A deep weariness gripped him, and he realized that all his struggle, all the horror he was going through, was just manipulation. He sat down on the floor and, feeling his consciousness slowly but surely leaving him, whispered, as if saying goodbye, "And what will happen now?" In response, he heard only a slight rustle and a phrase filled with cold. "Now your new cycle begins." Hello everyone, friends. Welcome to the channel where we reveal the most terrifying and frightening stories, now from words to deeds. Imagine an ordinary suburb. Solid identical houses, manicured lawns, silence. But each of them keeps its own secrets, and some of them are so terrible that people do not even think how close the real horror can be. Let's start with one such story. Her characters are two families who once lived next door and spent Halloween together. The usual tradition. They gathered, decorated houses, had a small party with costumes, and, of course, a mandatory trip for sweets. But this Halloween is the last one they will spend together. These families have been friends for more than 10 years, met every Friday for dinner, went on vacation together. However, closer to the last Halloween, one of the children, the Miller family's son, 15-year-old Josh, began to behave strangely. He became withdrawn, irritable, and spent hours alone in his room. When his parents, Sarah and Dan, tried to talk to him, he shut down even more. Josh said he was just tired, but his parents noticed how he was getting gloomier every day. One day, his father, Dan, noticed that Josh began to go out at night, disappearing from the house for a long time. When Dan asked him what was going on, his son replied that he was just going for a walk to get his thoughts in order. But he never explained what those thoughts were. Sarah began to notice the loss of things from home. At first it was small things, one of her favorite bracelets, a strange carved box that a friend gave her. Later, the money began to disappear, although Josh himself stubbornly denied that he had taken it. On the eve of Halloween, Sarah decided to talk to Carol's neighbor, the mother of Lisa, Josh's best friend. However, as it turned out, Lisa has also been acting strangely lately. She began to avoid her parents, hid in her room more and more often, and, as it turned out, also left at night. When Carol tried to ask her directly, she closed off and said only that everyone will understand Sue. When Sarah and Carol discussed the behavior of children, they decided that teenagers were just going through a typical age crisis. Halloween this year was supposed to help bring them back to their old rhythm. Parties, costumes, laughter, and a little harmless fun. It was decided that the gala dinner would be held, as usual, at the Miller house. However, when Halloween evening arrived, the atmosphere in the house seemed tense from the very beginning. Josh and Lisa looked distracted and pale, barely keeping up a conversation. Every time someone tried to talk to them, they exchanged brief glances, as if they were hiding some secret. When the rest of the family and neighbors joined the dinner, Carol, feeling anxious, tried to attract Lisa's attention, but she only replied with a dry, "Mom, let's not do it now." The holidays seemed to be going a little nervously, but the guests tried to bring back the fun by asking each other about Halloween plans, costumes, and upcoming events. Dan, trying to create a festive atmosphere, invited everyone to tell scary stories. Lisa, suddenly animated, was the first to take the floor. "What if I tell you about our school?" she said, looking at Josh. A sarcastic smile flashed across her face, and she began to tell a story about how all the windows and doors in the old wing of the school were closed, ostensibly for safety, but for some reason everyone who went there alone heard strange noises. At this point, the adults, although they laughed, noticed. Lisa talked about it with an unusual confidence and coldness for her. And then Josh added, "But no one has seen what's inside. Maybe it's not the sounds at all." These words seemed to burn everyone at the table. Josh got up and, giving his parents a dismissive look, went to his room. Lisa followed him. The adults looked at each other, not knowing how to react. After a few minutes, Sarah decided that the conversation had gone too far, and went upstairs to check on what the teenagers were doing. She went to the door of Josh's room and knocked, but there was no answer. Pushing open the door, she saw that the room was empty and the window was ajar. Behind him, in the dark on the street, the figures of her son and Lisa were visible. They were walking somewhere without looking back. Alarmed, Sarah ran to Dan. She tried to explain, but her voice was shaking. "Josh and Lisa are gone. They just ran away from home, as if they were up to something." Dan immediately rushed to the door, followed by the others. They split up and went to look for the teenagers through the streets and the nearby forest. More than half an hour had passed, but there was no sign of Josh and Lisa. At some point, walking around an empty lot on the outskirts of the neighborhood, Dan noticed movement at an old house that had been empty for a long time. The windows were locked, there was no electricity inside, but because of the sparse lanterns, two figures could be seen gliding between the rooms. Dan looked closer and realized that it was Josh and Lisa. They were standing inside an empty house, as if they were looking for something. Dan hesitated before deciding to enter, feeling a strange mixture of fear and excitement. Taking a flashlight, he walked through the weeds and dirt to the sagging door. A slight creak echoed through the empty house when he pushed it, and immediately saw that the children were looking at him with faces that read either anger or incomprehension. "Josh, what are you doing here? What's going on here anyway? What is it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. But Josh didn't answer. He looked at Lisa, and she slowly, almost indifferently, shrugged her shoulders, as if to show that all this was just a game for her, and Dan should not interfere. But this silence only fueled his anxiety even more. "We found something here," Lisa finally said, as if it was something ordinary. "You didn't know, did you? This house belonged to a family that once lived next to us." Her voice trailed off, and she glanced quickly at Josh. Dan remembered that the house had been empty for many years. It stood on the outskirts, surrounded by weeds and dilapidated fences. Some of the neighbors said that the previous owners left suddenly, abandoning almost all their belongings. But neither he nor Sarah had ever thought about what could actually make people leave home so suddenly. "Why are you here? What are you looking for here anyway?" Lisa narrowed her eyes and said, looking straight at him, "We knew there was something left in the basement." Josh accidentally came across an old note, something like a diary, abandoned in the attic of our school. It said that someone had left traces of the past here, and they should be in the basement. While she was talking, Josh opened the door leading to the basement. Dan immediately felt a damp, musty smell coming out of the dark doorway. He realized that he could not leave the children alone, and, holding a flashlight, carefully began to follow them down the stairs. It was cold and dark in the basement. The plaster on the walls was crumbling, and the wooden beams were barely holding on, creaking under every step. The lantern picked out scraps of old furniture, debris, remnants of things that once may have belonged to people who lived here. Several old crates were lined up along the wall, and dust and dirt covered every inch of the room. Lisa and Josh stopped at one of the boxes, and while Dan was watching them, Lisa reached out and pulled out a stack of old letters from a pile of trash. "We found them last time," Lisa said. "It says here that this family was trying to hide something important." She hesitated a little. "Someone tried to intimidate them. And that was the last Halloween they lived here." "Intimidate? By what?" Dan asked, feeling a chill run through his skin. "It looks like they were being chased," Josh replied, finally speaking. His voice was low and he wasn't looking at his father. "These letters, They were warnings, with threats, but they didn't believe it until it was too late. Dan looked at the papers in the children's hands with horror. The corners were torn. The ink was barely visible on the yellowed pages, but the meaning of some lines could still be made out. There were phrases. "Do not think that you will be able to escape. We will be watching you. Your children are in danger." Strange threats that may have seemed crazy or a joke at the time. While Dan was trying to make sense of what he had read, Lisa opened another letter, which, apparently, was written by one of the parents. It mentioned that someone had left notes on their doorstep, and every day their contents became more sinister. "They turned me in. I can't hide anymore. But if they do find me, they won't stop. Take the children away. Make sure they don't see what's hiding in the basement." With every word, Dan felt a chill creep over his body. The words were simple, but there was something in them that did not fit into my head. He was trying to figure out what it was about, and who these people who allegedly harassed the family were. But there was something else. In the corner of the letter, as if by accident, a strange number was added, 19. At first glance, it didn't make sense, but Dan couldn't shake the feeling that it was some kind of clue, a clue. Why was it so important? He didn't know, but the feelings of anxiety only grew stronger. "What does this figure mean?" he asked the children quietly. "We thought it might be something like an address," Lisa replied, handing him another letter, where the number 19 was repeated again, but in a different context. This letter mentioned a man who allegedly disappeared without a trace, but it is strange that his last letters were addressed not to his family, but to some unknown persons. Dan took a deep breath and looked at the children. They were engrossed in this investigation as if it was just a game. But one thing was clear to him. Something was wrong here. There were too many coincidences, too many strange circumstances that did not add up to one picture. "We have to get out of here," he said, trying to pull himself together. "It's all too dangerous." But Lisa didn't react. She continued flipping through the letters as if she hadn't heard him. Josh was already at the basement wall, looking for something in the shadows, his body sliding on the wet surface. Dan took a step towards him, but then he noticed something glinting from behind the old boxes. He came closer and saw that they were old photographs covered with dust. They depicted a family that once lived in this house. All the photos were taken in different years, but each had the same strange detail. One of the figures always remained hidden, as if someone was trying to cut it out of the frame. The faces in the other pictures were cloudy, blurred, and even from the expressions it was possible to understand that the people in them felt danger, anxiety. "What does this mean?" Dan said aloud. Lisa finally raised her head, and her gaze was cold and empty. "It's all part of what's left here," she said. "And you haven't figured out what happened yet. You should know that this family, they tried to hide, but they couldn't." Dan felt a chill run down his spine. He realized that they had not found anything good. They didn't just find a random note or old stuff. They came across something that was left here for a reason. The records, the photos, the numbers all indicated that this family's past was connected to something much more dangerous than they could have imagined. Dan was ready to leave, but something inside him pulled him on. He couldn't just leave it all behind. Dan couldn't get up and leave. His thoughts were clouded like a thick fog with every step he took, getting closer to those old photos and notes. He looked at the children. Their faces were cold and lifeless, as if they no longer felt the anxiety that tormented him. They looked like they knew more than they could say. "What does it all mean? What is it?" he asked again, but his voice sounded muffled in the basement, as if absorbed by the dark atmosphere of this place. Lisa didn't answer. She stood in silence while Josh continued to rummage through the old crates. Dan suddenly realized that something was wrong. He felt a chill creeping over his body, not because of the temperature, but because there was a sense of inevitability hanging around this house. Every movement here, every look, even that terrible smell coming from the dampness and mold, was filled with some kind of tension, an unspeakable threat that made no sense, but was inescapable. He felt his heart begin to beat faster. Suddenly, Josh abruptly raised his head and looked at him, but there was not the understanding in his eyes that should have been in his son's eyes. It was a strange look, frightening in its emptiness. He looked at Lisa, and she also didn't seem to notice how her hair began to move, as if something invisible was touching her head. "We have to leave now," Dan said, not hiding the panic in his voice. But it was too late. There was a soft creak from behind the old door leading to the other end of the basement. Dan whirled around, but saw nothing. However, the sound was so clear and ominous that it sent goosebumps down my body. He took a step forward, feeling his breathing become heavy. Then he heard something else. It was a barely noticeable noise, quiet but growing. His heart began to pound with renewed vigor. He looked back at the children. Josh stood absolutely still, like a statue, and Lisa was in the same state, her eyes frozen in a blank stare. They didn't react when he called them, as if they were waiting for something. Dan ran up to them and grabbed Lisa by the shoulder. She didn't move. Only her fingers slowly clenched into fists. He turned her towards him, and her eyes, her daughter's eyes, were no longer human. It wasn't just a blank stare. It was a look that knew no fear. "You don't understand," she whispered softly, barely moving her lips. At that moment, Dan realized that their bodies, their faces, were all alien. They were replaced by something. He stepped back, feeling his legs weaken. He couldn't think. His mind couldn't keep up with what was happening. Then he heard footsteps. Footsteps that were approaching from a dark corner of the basement. It was something alive, something heavy and unnatural, as if it were not human. Dan screamed, turning sharply, and saw a figure emerge from the darkness, but not a human one. It was a body that was not fully formed, sagging like a shadow, and yet possessed some kind of terrifying reality. It moved as if there was no one inside, but there was an indescribable malicious intent in it. Dan couldn't move from fear. He could hear the image approaching. And for a moment I understood. It wasn't the fear of the unknown. It was the fear of something that had been sitting here for a long time, within these walls, in this empty, collapsed life. And suddenly everything became quiet. When Dan came to, the basement was empty, and the children had disappeared as if they had never existed. Everything around them, those old photographs, letters, captured darkness and horror, disappeared as if they had never existed. But the note with the number 19 remained, lying right in front of him. Now that Dan was back in the empty basement, there was only one question left in his mind. Where are they? Dan stood there, terrified, unable to move. He felt his chest tighten, and every breath was difficult. This place was the same as before, but everything was out of place. It was as if the world around him had ceased to be reality. Dan's gaze slid over the dusty walls, which still had traces of old wallpaper that had peeled off under the influence of time and dampness. But now these walls seemed alive to him. It was as if they were breathing, sucking in air, becoming part of something more sinister and incomprehensible. He went to the basement door, and then noticed that the floorboards around it were slightly raised, as if someone had been looking for something here for a long time. Suddenly, Dan felt a strange, unspeakable anxiety emanating from the door itself. It wasn't just closed, it was more than just a basement entrance. She was a barrier. Gritting his teeth, he pushed it open decisively, and the door barely responded, creaking and pitifully echoing in the void. He stepped into the corridor into which her opening opened the way, and then his gaze stopped at something that clearly shouldn't be here. They were old brick walls, with peeling paint, but an inscription was scratched on one of the bricks. "You're not alone here." Dan felt his breath catch in his throat. His legs gave way and he fell to his knees. His heart was pounding wildly, and his whole body was trembling with unbearable fear. He knew it couldn't just be a coincidence. Someone or something was nearby. At that moment, as if in response to his panicked reaction, a sound suddenly rang out of the darkness, so clear and piercing that Dan jumped to his feet, unable to take his eyes off this black abyss. It was as if someone or something was moving in the dark corners of the corridor, getting closer. Dan realized that his fear was not just a consequence of the unknown. He was part of this place, part of what was hidden behind its walls. Every word, every threat left in the letters, was now becoming a reality. He ran. On the other side of the wall, in the corridor, the sound of his footsteps echoed, and suddenly everything disappeared, became quiet. At that moment, he realized that he no longer cared who or what was standing in front of him. He could no longer separate reality from nightmare. Dan was rushing around the house, mindlessly running through empty, broken rooms. He tried to find a way out, but everything was closed. The doors were locked, the windows wouldn't open. There was no way to leave anymore, and his own body had already stopped obeying. He was trapped, and the only question he could ask himself was, why? When everything went quiet and Dan finally stopped, his gaze fell back on the number 19 scratched on the wall. He realized that it was not just a number. It was the number of his own cage. And at that moment, the whole room, all the walls, all the sounds around his body merged into one thing. He became a part of this nightmare, and he knew there was no way out. Tom, a photographer with a rare talent for capturing the atmosphere of the moment, was known for his series of shots of abandoned buildings and places that urban legends whispered about. He had a special approach. He was looking not just for old buildings, but for those in which people could feel the remnants of the lives that once boiled here. These were abandoned schools, motels, and children's camps. But the most discussed project was an old house on the outskirts of the city, a massive building overgrown with ivy, with faded wallpaper, where a boarding house for the elderly used to be located. This house has been the site of many rumors. Residents said that once there was an incident, after which the boarding house was closed. Thomas did not have access to the archives, but he was sure that there was something frightening and forbidden behind all this. After several unsuccessful attempts to get permission to shoot, he decided to enter at night, quietly, secretly, in order to capture the atmosphere of abandonment. His friend Mike, who is fond of building history and rumors, contacted him the day before the visit and handed over a stack of old documents found in the archives of the city library. The yellowed sheets contained fragments of reports and personal notes written by former employees of the boarding house. Among them was a particularly disturbing note. "We have been noticing strange manifestations in new patients for a week now. First they complain about other people's voices, then about the lack of sleep and the fear that grips them at night. 3 nurses applied for dismissal without explaining the reasons. I understand that this can be attributed to the age of the patients, but I can't ignore the feeling that something is wrong in this building." The note ended abruptly, as if it had been written in a hurry, without finishing the thought. This awakened Tom's excitement and alertness at the same time. The boarding house has been empty for more than 10 years. Tom felt that perhaps he would find not only exciting footage, but also answers to the questions that had been tormenting everyone who had heard about the cursed building for so long. Evening came. Darkness enveloped the streets of the city, and only a few lamps dimly illuminated the sidewalks. Tom and Mike parked nearby, choosing a place hidden from prying eyes. They took with them flashlights, a camera, batteries, and several sheets of notes found in the archive. There was silence all around, interrupted only by the rustle of leaves and the occasional sound of night birds. As they approached the gate of the boarding house, the friends felt a cold gust of wind, which seemed to be trying to stop them. The old metal sign with the inscription, "Willow House," swayed in the wind and creaked, as if it whispered something unpleasant. Tom shone his flashlight on the way, and they cautiously went inside. The interior was a mess. The furniture was covered with a thick layer of dust, and the wallpaper hung in tatters. Broken wires hung from the ceiling. In the distance, the boards could be heard cracking under their feet, treacherously indicating their every step. Tom moved slowly down the hallway, taking pictures every few meters. The lens picked up the smallest details: cracks in the walls, traces of old pipes, and mysterious marks, as if someone was trying to scratch something out. Mike, trying to keep up, flipped through the documents he found. One of them talked about a patient named Gregory, who, apparently, caused chaos in the boarding house. The man was quiet and polite, but at night his screams echoed through the corridors. One day he disappeared, and not a single employee could explain how it happened. Suddenly, there was a sound from the next room, as if something had fallen. Both men froze. Tom's heart began to pound so hard that it seemed as if his pounding could be heard in the silence. They looked at each other. Mike's eyes expressed a mixture of fear and curiosity. Tom waved at him, telling him to move slowly and silently. They went to the door from which the sound came and looked inside. There was an old office with a massive wooden table and cupboards half filled with old documents. One of the drawers was open, papers scattered on the floor. Tom took a step inside, lighting up the room with a flashlight. It seemed that everything here was frozen in time. Photos on the walls, calendars dated a decade ago, and an old phone on the table. But most of all, something else caught my attention. There was a neatly folded note in the center of the table. On the yellowed paper, it was written in ink: "I do not know how much longer I can stand it. The screams don't stop, and every time I close my eyes, it feels like they're getting closer. Yesterday, in the silence of the night, I heard someone calling my name. Every day I become more and more convinced that these are not just my fantasies. We all need to leave." Mike read the note and felt a chill run down his spine. "Tom, this is getting too weird. These documents indicate that the staff also heard something at night. I do not know what happened here, but maybe this is not the place where we should be." But Tom was determined. He picked up the camera and started taking pictures of the office. Suddenly, the lamp on the ceiling swung, making a creaking sound. Mike rushed to the door, but stopped when he heard a muffled voice behind Thomas. "Did you hear that?" Tom pointed to the window. Outside, behind a layer of dirt and cobwebs, something like a shadow flickered. She was too quick to catch her features, but she was obvious enough to awaken fear. Mike felt his palms sweating and his breathing became heavier. "We have to leave," he whispered, looking at his friend, but Tom had already opened the door leading to the hallway. Halfway down the long corridor, where the walls seemed closer than they really were, the friends heard a rustle behind them. Both turned sharply and lit the way, but saw nothing. Tom continued to move forward, but now his steps were more cautious, and his gaze constantly wandered around. When they reached the stairs leading to the second floor, they felt a sharp smell of mold and dampness. Here, the walls were covered with old photographs of the residents of the boarding house. The faces in the pictures seemed too real. Their eyes seemed to be following their friends' every move. They climbed the creaking stairs, and every step echoed in the empty, gloomy corridors. Tom knew something was wrong, but he kept going forward as if there was no way back. Mike, feeling growing uneasiness, lagged behind more and more. His gaze constantly darted around, catching glimpses of shadows and strange sounds that had previously remained almost unnoticeable. When they reached the second floor, the corridor turned out to be narrower and more confusing, with doors leading to the same vaguely forgotten rooms. It seems that this floor has not seen people for a long time. Dust in the air, cracked glass, dimmed lamps, all this made the atmosphere even more ominous. Tom went to one of the doors and carefully opened it. It was dark inside, but through the crack the flashlight illuminated strange markings on the walls, similar to drawings or signs. Mike stood back, hesitating to enter. "What is it?" His voice sounded anxious, as if these signs might not just be artful drawings, but something much more dangerous. Tom, ignoring his questions, entered the room. On the table in the center stood an old box, tied with ropes. "It's too obvious that she's been here for a long time." He bent down cautiously, trying to see what was inside, But suddenly there was that strange rustling again that they had heard downstairs. The rustling had intensified and was now becoming almost conscious, as if something or someone was moving nearby. Tom froze for a moment. He couldn't figure out where the sounds were coming from, but they were clearly getting closer. In a panic, he grabbed the box and quickly opened it. There was a note inside, just like in that office, only much older. It was stained and almost illegible, but a few words were still legible. "They're not leaving. They're watching us. To try to escape is to lose." As if to confirm his words, a strange, almost tangible chill suddenly enveloped the corridor. Mike came closer, and the same fear showed on his face as in Tom's eyes. "We're not alone here, Tom," he whispered, barely able to keep the tremor out of his voice. Tom looked back at the door they were walking towards. It was ajar, and the fog was visible behind it. It seems that everything around began to dim, absorb light, as if reality itself began to crumble into pieces. He hurriedly went to the door, but suddenly something rattled in the hallway, and they both turned sharply. The shadows they had seen before were now apparent. They moved as if sliding along the walls, and their contours gradually became clearer. They weren't just reflections of light, they were figures, people, or something similar to humans, but devoid of human appearance. Creatures with distorted facial features and blurred contour lines. "This can't be real," Mike croaked, but his voice broke on the last word. Tom didn't seem to hear him. He stood staring into the void, as if something had caught his attention in the darkest part of the corridor. His gaze was absorbed by some mysterious force, and he stepped forward, not noticing the horror that gripped his friend. "We have to leave, right now," Mike finally managed to squeeze out, and grabbing Tom by the shoulder, dragged him back. But Tom didn't move. "I can't. I have to stay. I need to understand what this is." His words were uncertain, as if he was in a trance. Mike screamed as he felt the cold tighten around his heart. The creatures, or what seemed to them to be creatures, began to approach, and their eyes seemed too bright in this darkness. Mike panicked at every glance. "Tom, please, we can't stay here." And at that moment, everything around them suddenly became hazy, and the ceiling began to descend. As if the building itself began to shrink, Tom came to his senses abruptly when Mike grabbed him by the shoulder again and pulled him towards the exit. He seemed a little confused, but when he saw his friend trembling with fear, he realized that it was time to act. "Come on," Mike breathed, and they almost ran to the stairs. But along the way, Tom noticed that their movements had become difficult. The stairs became slippery underfoot, and the air became heavy. Climbing up, they almost slipped several times, almost losing their balance, since there was not even the slightest hint of fresh air in the corridor. When they reached the ground floor, everything was quieter than before. The sound of their footsteps no longer echoed through the empty house, as if they were treading on some soft carpets. Pausing for a second to catch his breath, Tom again felt a strange tension in the air that did not go away. It's not okay." Mike looked around again, as if something restless was gnawing at him from the inside. "We still don't know what happened to this place." Tom nodded. He himself felt a strange heaviness cover them more and more, but he could not explain what exactly felt so alien and scary in this place. They reached the door leading outside, and Tom, despite his alarm, pulled on the handle. But the door was locked. "What the hell?" Mike blurted out, and he tried to push her. Breathing heavily, Tom also tried to open it, but to no avail. He panicked, and his hands began to fiddle nervously with the door. "Okay, let's look for the window," Mike said, distracted by the search for another way out. They began to inspect the walls and the corridor. It looked like there was too little room for shelter and exit. It seems the building wasn't as big as they thought it was when they entered. Mike turned back to the door, trying to figure out what was wrong. His mind was full of questions. It wasn't just an abandoned house or an empty office. It was a trace of the remaining people, their sense of presence. "I feel like there's something wrong here," Mike said, examining the floor. "It's like they belong to someone, but they're not alive." Tom, before he realized what he was doing, went to the wall and knocked on it. There was a distinct sound from the impact, as if something inside was empty. He continued to knock, and soon a small crack appeared on the wall. "It can't be." Mike walked over to him and examined the damage. Could it be some kind of hidden passage? "Did you find something?" Tom froze and began to carefully move away part of the wall. To his surprise, she began to move away, revealing a narrow passage covered with dust and cobwebs. In the dark corridor they found, only their breathing could be heard. "It's weird," Mike said, "but we have to go somewhere anyway, otherwise we won't get out of here." Tom didn't mind. He wasn't sure what had happened, but something about this place made him keep walking. As they stepped into the passageway, the floor became hollow under their feet again, as if they were walking through an old basement. After walking a few meters, they saw another door, but it was slightly ajar. There was silence inside. Without feeling the slightest fear, Tom cautiously opened the door. The room they entered was small. An old lamp stood on the table, barely illuminating the room. On the shelves along the walls were the same old boxes they had seen in other rooms, all covered with dust. But the strangest detail was the fact that among all this they found another note. It was almost the same as the one in the office, but this time the text was clearer, without spots. Tom carefully picked up the note from the table. This time his hands were not shaking. He read slowly, trying to make sense of every word, but something in his eye twitched when he realized that this was not just another warning note, but something much more disturbing. "If you are here, then you have found more than just a way out. It's the same here. And there is no one who can help. It's too late." Tom felt a chill run down his spine, but continued to read. Everyone who tried to leave here faced the fact that they could not return. "I tried, but it got worse every time. Go away. Don't stay." Mike stood by, silently, waiting for his friend's reaction. When Tom lowered the note, his gaze was blank, but Mike's eyes were anxiously boring into him, trying to catch every movement. "We have to leave," Mike said, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. "This is something wrong." Tom didn't answer, but he knew Mike was right. He felt that there was not just a sense of threat coming from this place, but as if every object, every crack in the walls and every movement they made was being observed by someone or something. They could leave, but they didn't know if they could leave this place alive. They both turned around, deciding to leave, but when they stepped to the door, their eyes accidentally met. From the dark corner of the room where the old boxes stood, there was a sound as if someone abruptly stood up from his seat, and something heavy rustled on the floor. They both froze. Without making a sound, they stood as if someone was watching them, hiding in dark corners. Mike sighed softly and tugged at Tom's sleeve. "Please, let's just leave," he said in a strangled voice. But Tom was already at the door. He opened it and they went back into the hallway, trying to hold their breath, but the sound of footsteps echoed off the walls, as if someone else was walking behind them. Then, when they were in the hallway, everything became even more strange. The floor suddenly turned out to be completely smooth, as if it were made of rubber, and the air became heavy, with a smell of old raw materials and a stench that could not be ignored. Suddenly Mike stopped, turning to Tom with an astonished face. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Tom listened. At first it seemed to him that it was just their own footsteps, but soon he realized that it was a different sound, quiet and almost imperceptible. But it got louder with every step. The sound of footsteps, but not theirs, not human ones. It was something heavy, footsteps with a metallic clang, as if someone was dragging something hard and bulky behind them. Mike was looking at Tom, his eyes wide open. For a moment, they both froze in horror. "It can't be," Mike said in confusion, but he started moving anyway. "We are not alone. We are not alone." Tom was silent because there was only one thing in his head. He needed to get out. He headed for the door at the end of the corridor, but just as his hand was about to reach the handle, the door suddenly swung open. Tom took a step back, and in front of him was not a man, but a figure in an old torn suit. It wasn't a living thing, it was just there. His face was blurred, as if all the details were distorted, like a reflection in water that was about to splash. He took a step towards them without making a single sound. It all happened slowly, but at some point Tom and Mike realized that it wasn't just something strange. It was something that had died long ago, but still remained in this place. Trying to leave, they rushed to the stairs, but after walking a couple of steps, they suddenly stopped. The whole space around them seemed to shrink, and it became unbearably difficult to breathe. The walls seemed to be pressing down on them. It wasn't just a building, it was a nightmare in which everything was frozen, where there were no exits, and all these curses left in the records were real. Tom tried to grab Mike's arm, but Mike, with a crazy look, kept trying to get away. He was shouting something, but his voice was muffled and empty. The sound squeezed his chest, and Tom could barely breathe. I've always considered myself an adventurer. Since childhood, I have been attracted to abandoned buildings, moss-covered stairs, and creaking floors, under which history was hidden. As a teenager, I often climbed abandoned houses, feeling a rush of adrenaline and enjoying a slight fear. But one day everything changed. This happened when I was a university student, studying architecture and aspiring to create my own YouTube channel that would stand out from others like it. The idea was simple: to explore abandoned places, telling the audience about their history and secrets. Views were growing. People were asking for more content. One day, a subscriber sent me a message. "Have you heard about the house on Hollow Street? They say people disappear without a trace there." It immediately caught my attention. Hollow Street was famous for its bad reputation. Old residents recalled that at the end of the street, surrounded by dense trees, there was a house that no one wanted to talk about. It was said that it was built at the beginning of the last century by a wealthy family who disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Since then, the house has been empty, but rumors about his mysterious aura have only intensified. I decided to take a chance and went there with a camera. The day turned out to be cloudy, which added to the entourage. The road to the house was covered with a layer of damp foliage, and the closer I got, the more anxious I felt. The old mansion looked like something out of a scary fairy tale. A massive wooden door, cracks on the walls, and overgrown bushes clinging to the windows. At the entrance, I was met by a threshold with carvings in the form of predatory animals, covered with dust and dirt. I pointed the camera at the door, commenting to the audience. "Here it is, the legendary door of Hollow Street. They say it's impossible to get out of here after it closes." The words themselves sounded scary, and goosebumps ran down my skin. I pushed the door open, and it gave way with a heavy creak. There was a thick silence inside, broken only by my footsteps and the echo. Cobwebs covered the corners. Furniture was scattered, as if someone had left the house in a panic. I whispered to the camera, "Perhaps these are the remains of the last night when someone lived here." I took a few steps forward, and the creaking of the floor echoed through the empty house. The setting was gloomy. Antique paintings covered in dust, moldy carpets, and furniture that seemed frozen in its last use. I filmed it all, explaining every detail to the audience, trying to convey the atmosphere of oppressive silence that surrounded me. When I reached the center of the living room, I noticed a torn piece of paper on the floor. When I picked it up, I saw that it was an old note with shaky and illegible lines. "They come when everything is quiet. Never open the door after midnight." A strange chill ran down my spine. I put the note back and decided to check what was in the other rooms. The kitchen was next. There was a single plate on the table with dried leftovers covered with mold. Everyday little things that always seem so everyday, in this context looked like traces of a forgotten life. The kitchen floor creaked especially loudly, and it seemed that with every step it would break under me. But I was lucky. I got to the window, which overlooked the overgrown garden, where an old fountain could be seen in the shade. His figures, covered with moss, were reminiscent of former luxury. I continued to move around the house until I came to a narrow staircase leading to the second floor. The boards under my feet didn't just creak, they sighed under my weight, as if the house was aware of the presence of an outsider. The steps were so narrow that I instinctively grabbed the handrail, which was peeling and crunching under my hand. When I got up, I saw a corridor with several doors. There was a slight grinding sound behind one of them. Frozen in place, I listened. The screeching sound was repeated, slow, agonizing, as if someone was scratching the wall. His hand moved involuntarily to the door handle. "I'm going to check what's in there," I said to the camera, and my voice was shaking. I turned the handle and slowly opened the door. There was a children's room inside. The walls, once painted with bright colors, have peeled off and turned gray. In one corner was a cradle covered in dust and cobwebs, and in another corner was a broken toy horse with its eyes cut out. A strange sound was coming from under the bed. I turned the light of the lantern there and froze. There was an old puppet theater under the bed, a small wooden stage with curtains burned at the edges. The dust swirled from my breathing, and the air seemed to become even heavier. I bent down and tried to see what was inside the theater. At first I thought they were just mechanical dolls, small figures in antique costumes. But one of them was facing me, and his mouth was cut out, from which a paper note was peeking out. I carefully pulled it out, trying not to disturb the other dolls. The note was folded several times, and when I opened it, I saw a small, nervous handwriting. "We were hiding here, but they found us anyway." I froze after reading this. Who are they? I looked around, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The room was still silent, but the air was filled with an inexplicable tension. I put the camera on the floor, pointing it at the bed to take a closer look at the dolls and the note. Suddenly, somewhere in the house, there was a muffled knock, short and deep, as if someone had hit the door with force. The sound echoed through the walls, and my heart began to pound wildly. I grabbed the camera and straightened up. "Did you guys hear that?" I whispered into the microphone, feeling my hands tremble. The steps. This time they sounded clearer and were approaching the stairs. I turned my head towards the door, trying to see who or what it might be, but the hallway was empty. However, the knocking grew louder, and I realized that it was coming from below, where the front door was. Too late, I realized that I had left it ajar. The creaking of the stairs under the weight of someone else's footsteps made me freeze. My heart was beating so loudly that I was afraid someone would hear it. I pointed the camera at the door and took off the flashlight. The light reflected off the old, cracked paint, creating bizarre shadows on the walls. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a sharp knock, as if someone had hit the door with a fist. Before I knew it, the door was abruptly flung open. The door slammed against the wall, and I instinctively staggered back. A man's figure appeared in the hallway. For a moment, it seemed to me that I was seeing a ghost, so strange and inappropriate was his presence in this house. But no, it was a very real person. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a rough face hidden under a thick beard. His eyes seemed to be boring into me. "What are you doing here?" he croaked, in a voice steeped in anger and fatigue. I stood there in silence, unable to say a word. My camera was still recording in my hands, but I was too paralyzed by fear to notice it. The man took a few steps forward, his heavy boots leaving deep dents on the floor. "Do you understand that this is private property? No one belongs here," he continued, coming closer. Finally, I was able to squeeze out a few words. I'm just filming for my channel. I was told that this house is empty." The man frowned, and a shadow of surprise flashed across his face, but it was only for a moment. Then he grabbed my shoulder and forcefully turned me towards the exit. "We can't stay here," he said with an alarm that seemed unexpected for his rough appearance. "Go away and don't come back." I tried to protest, but he only squeezed my shoulder harder, not giving me the opportunity to resist. His rough grip left bruises, and I felt panic fill me more and more. I saw something more than just anger in his eyes. It was a mixture of fear and regret. He pushed me out into the hallway, and we started down the creaking stairs. At every step, the old boards creaked in protest, and I involuntarily looked back, expecting something even more sinister. When we reached the ground floor, I noticed that the door was still open and a cold wind was blowing through the room, stirring the curtains. "Why are you kicking me out so persistently? What's going on here?" I finally asked, feeling my voice tremble. The man stopped and gave me a painful look. He looked like he was deciding whether he should say something or just send me out and forget about it. "You don't understand anything." His voice became quieter, and he looked as if inner demons were fighting in him. "Things have happened here that are better not to know about. This place has killed a lot of people, and if you want to save your life, go away and forget the way here." His words sounded like a sentence, and I wanted to ask more, but he pushed me out the door and then slammed the door behind him. Once outside, I felt the cold air burn my skin. I stood at a loss, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The wind had picked up, blowing leaves down the empty street, and the gloomy house seemed like a living thing watching me through the cracked windows. Despite my fear and common sense, I had a gnawing feeling of incompleteness. I wanted to find out the truth, to understand why this man reacted so strongly to my presence and what was really going on in this house. When I left the house behind, I still had a thirst for answers. I decided that I would come back here, but with preparation and not alone. The next day, going through the recorded materials, I noticed that the camera recorded a conversation with a man. I listened to his words several times, feeling my anxiety rise with each repetition. His voice was too tense, and there was such sincerity in it that there was no doubt that he really believed what he was saying. I started looking for information about this house, but all I found was the same legend about the missing family and the subsequent strange incidents. But there was one detail that I hadn't heard about before. The neighboring houses were demolished a few years ago, and only this one remained standing, as if forgotten by everyone. A week later, I contacted one of my friends, who specialized in urban studies, and told him about the house and the meeting with the mysterious stranger. We agreed to return there together, this time with a more thoughtful plan and additional equipment. When we arrived at the house at night, there was the same tense silence in the air. This time the door was locked. We went around the house and found a window that opened easily, allowing us to get inside. The living room was still the same, but now it felt even more clearly menacing. The puppet theater I found last time was gone, as if someone had deliberately removed it to hide the evidence. We split up, and my friend started looking around the second floor while I stayed downstairs. Suddenly, his loud scream came from the upper floor. I rushed upstairs, jumping over the steps, and found him in the very nursery where I found the note. I found my friend with a frozen gaze directed at the same bed under which I found the puppet theater. However, now there was a strange, barely audible rustle coming from there, as if someone was trying to whisper unintelligible words. His face was pale and his hands were shaking. "What's in there?" I asked, trying not to let panic get the better of me. "There. Someone's moving," he breathed, not looking away. We stood there, as if spellbound, until the rustling stopped. I bent down and carefully looked under the bed, directing the light of the lantern there. This time there was no theater or puppets under it, but instead there were fresh scratches on the floor, as if someone was trying to get out with sharp nails. Suddenly, there was a crackling sound from behind, as if someone had come to the door. I turned around abruptly and saw the man who pushed me out of the house last time. But now his face was distorted with panic. "Why did you come back?" he shouted, grabbing the door frame. "I told you that you can't stay here." Before I could reply, the floor beneath us shook and cracks ran down the walls. The man rushed forward and grabbed my friend by the arm, pulling him out of the room. We ran out into the corridor, which now seemed alive. The boards creaked and moved, as if there was not a house under our feet, but a ship in a storm. From somewhere in the depths of the building, a hollow, long-drawn sound like a roar was heard. "Run down to the exit," the man shouted, pushing us forward. We ran, jumping over the cracked stairs, until we found ourselves in the living room. The man stayed behind, as if something was holding him back. I looked back and saw him trying to close the door leading to the hallway, but she seemed to resist herself, leaving a gap. "Go away," he shouted once more before the door slammed shut. My friend and I ran out the door and turned towards the house. The windows were shaking, as if someone was knocking on the glass from inside, trying to get out. Then everything went quiet. The wind had stopped, and only a faint moonlight illuminated the empty street. We stood panting, not believing our eyes. "What was that?" my friend croaked, clutching his chest and trying to calm his breathing. "I do not know," I replied, realizing that now we will never know the full truth. The next morning I tried to contact the authorities and tell them about what had happened, but they just shrugged and said that the house had long been recognized as an emergency and access to it was prohibited. I haven't found any information about the man I met. Locals claimed that no neighbors had been there for many years. Despite all attempts, no answers have appeared. Time passed, but the house on Hollow Street remained standing, like a mute witness to events that no one dared to unravel. Jonathan Wells, a journalist with a reputation for not being afraid to ask awkward questions, was once assigned to write an article about an old abandoned hospital that many locals considered cursed. This building stood on the outskirts of the city, among wild thickets and broken trees, and had been attracting rumors and speculation for many years. However, the rumors were not about ghosts or mysterious silhouettes. People talked about strange sounds coming from inside, as if someone was moving through empty corridors, shouting incomprehensible words. The hospital was built many years ago and served as a shelter for patients who were considered terminally ill at that time. At that time, medical technology was far from modern, and the treatment was more like torture. People with various ailments were brought here, ranging from complex injuries to mental disorders. The names of the patients were rarely remembered, but the stories of their suffering left a deep mark. Jonathan remembered his grandfather telling him about his childhood, when he and his friends were afraid to even go near the hospital. They heard stories of those who went inside and came back with their eyes dilated, refusing to talk about what they saw. Some, however, were found later in the forest, muttering about the lights that called them. Over time, the city stopped discussing the hospital, as if it wanted to erase the memory of it. Jonathan decided to spend the night inside the building. Armed with a flashlight, camera, and notepad, he entered through a side door that defied time and rust. The dusty corridors greeted him with a booming echo of footsteps, and every creak of the floor echoed in his ears like the beat of a drum. Jonathan walked forward, the light of the lantern picking out pieces of peeling paint, graffiti, and dilapidated furniture remains. The dull echo of his every move became more and more eerie. He tried to convince himself that these sensations were just the result of a game of imagination and adrenaline, but a deep, lingering feeling of anxiety grew. In one of the rooms, behind a sagging door, Jonathan noticed old medical instruments left on a metal table. Scalpels, rusty clamps, and strange devices, the purpose of which was difficult to determine, lay in disarray. But what struck him most was a cracked leather book with yellowed pages. He carefully opened it and saw the notes made in sloppy handwriting. There was pain and fear in every line. Patient 17. The condition is unstable. Screams at night. Admits to being afraid of the light. Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. He closed the book and was about to leave the room when he heard something that made him freeze. It was a barely audible sound, like the rustle of paper or the rustle of footsteps on old linoleum. He froze, listening, trying to discern its source. But at that moment, there was a sharp sound in the corridor outside the door, as if something heavy had fallen and rolled on the floor. Jonathan's heart began to pound faster. He exhaled, trying to catch his breath, and went out into the corridor, directing the beam of the flashlight towards the source of the sound. Nothing. Only the distant gleams of light on the glass of old cabinets, which reflected his own movements. And then he noticed that the door he had left ajar was now closed. He froze, his blood froze in his veins. A closed door meant that someone or something could be in the building with him. He quickly turned back. The shadow cast by the broken window fell on his face. Suffocating fear began to rise in his throat, filling his lungs with a numbing feeling of panic. Jonathan slowly walked up to the door and slowly stretched out his hand to open it. But at that moment there was a rasping sound from the other side, as if someone was running something sharp on wood. He abruptly withdrew his hand and took a step back. Thoughts of possible escape options flashed through my head. Looking around, he noticed a staircase leading to the attic. Having no idea where this would lead him, he rushed to the stairs and, clutching the lantern to his chest, flew up the creaking steps. The attic smelled of dust and rot, and the light from the lantern picked out scraps of old newspapers and wooden beams, from which rusty nails stuck out in places. He held his breath, trying not to breathe too loudly. The silence weighed on my ears, and every breath seemed deafeningly loud. Suddenly, footsteps were heard below again. Slow, heavy, as if someone or something was looking for him. The footsteps approached and then stopped right under the stairs leading to the attic. Jonathan froze, feeling his heart about to burst out of his chest. At that moment, a barely audible whisper came from the dark corner of the attic, and for a split second he thought he caught a silhouette. Someone had been here all this time, watching him. The whispers grew louder, and Jonathan began to distinguish words that were unintelligible and confused, as if someone had repeated them over and over again. He raised the lantern, pointing it at the corner of the attic where the sounds were coming from. The light illuminated an old dust-covered doll with faded eyes and torn clothes lying on the floor. It was unexpected, but even more strange was that the whispering stopped instantly as soon as the light touched the doll. Jonathan felt a slight sense of relief for a second, but then his gaze fell on something else. Old, almost decayed papers were scattered next to the doll. He approached cautiously, keeping an eye on the stairs and doors in case he needed to escape. Picking up one of the papers, he saw a child's drawing. It depicted several figures standing next to a long building similar to this house. One of the figures stood out in particular. It was black, with painted red eyes and an ugly grin. At the bottom of the drawing were the words in a child's handwriting. "He is always here." Jonathan froze. These words seemed to be a warning, but at the same time incomprehensible, like a note from the distant past that somehow intersected with his current reality. His gaze fell back on the doll, and he noticed that its position had changed. The head was turned in his direction, although he was sure that this had not happened before. My heart began to beat faster, and an unconscious feeling of horror began to arise inside. At that moment, there was a thud from below, as if something heavy had fallen. Jonathan instinctively backed away to the opposite side of the attic, keeping his eyes on the stairs. The noise was repeated, and the sound of footsteps returned, this time faster and more decisively. Whoever it was coming upstairs. Jonathan frantically searched for a possible exit, noticing a small dusty window at the end of the attic. Running up to it, he tried to open it, but it jammed, and the wood became so dilapidated from time to time that it threatened to break. The attic door began to open slowly, accompanied by a prolonged creak. Jonathan tore himself away from the window and turned sharply, seeing how the light of the lantern fell on the empty doorway, but there was no one in sight. In the silence of the attic, the creaking of the floor underfoot reminded of the presence of an uninvited guest. His breathing quickened, and he tried to calm down to reduce his panic a little. "Hey, who's here?" Jonathan's voice faltered, but he forced himself to speak, hoping that it would attract the attention of the neighbors, if they could hear him at all. There was no answer, but a dead silence hung in the air, which was more oppressive than any sound. Jonathan turned his gaze back to the stairs. There was no one there anymore, but the feeling that he was being watched did not leave him. Finally, he decided to take a chance and rushed to the window, trying to knock it out with his elbow as quickly as possible. The glass cracked, and the scent of damp and old boards rushed into the cold night air. Barely had he made a hole big enough to squeeze through when he heard footsteps, fast and heavy, heading towards him from behind. A sharp rush of adrenaline gave him strength, and he jumped down without hesitation, feeling the shards of glass cut his clothes and skin. The fall was short and painful, and he collapsed onto a pile of debris, which muffled the impact. There was a haze of pain for a few seconds, and Jonathan coughed, fighting for every breath. When his vision was restored, he looked back at the old house. Through the broken attic window, a shadow could be seen standing motionless, like the silhouette of a man. That was the last straw. Jonathan got to his feet and limped away without looking back. Through the pain and fog in his mind, one thing became clear. What he had found should have remained hidden. Eric, exhausted by anxious days and sleepless nights, was at the epicenter of his investigation. He gained access to abandoned archives that no one had ever seriously considered before. In musty basements, among old folders and broken drawers, he came across thin, yellowed sheets of paper, personal notes of a former guard who guarded the barracks area decades before the arena was built on this site. In these recordings, the guard described hearing muffled screams and seeing vague movements in the dark that could not be explained. One of his last posts read, "They look, but they don't come out until you show fear. They are not spirits. They are people whom no one sees or knows, but they are always here." Eric felt a cold sweat running down his back. He turned around in the dim basement, listening to the muffled sounds from above. The building seemed to be breathing, creaking with ancient beams that had expired. When he returned home, he uploaded all the materials he found to his computer to analyze the data and find clues. It was then that his journalistic intuition began to put together a picture that turned out to be far beyond his darkest assumptions. In one of the video files captured by a surveillance camera on the day of the match, he noticed something strange. As the players and spectators celebrated the victory noisily, several figures in dark clothes slipped between the rows, barely visible in the human stream. The camera recorded how they approached the exit and left the arena without attracting attention to themselves. Eric realized that this was not a coincidence. These people were connected with illness and death, which covered the participants of that game. The next day, he went to his detective friend to discuss the find. He agreed to help and took out the footage from the cameras, which captured the same figures coming out of the back door of the arena, which was rarely used. Combining all the data, they found that the mysterious people were connected to a private security organization known for its harsh methods of suppressing riots. Eric decided to contact the surviving witnesses of those events. One of them, a former employee of the arena, admitted that he had heard rumors of underground deals between the arena and those who called themselves Defenders of Order. These defenders held secret meetings and training sessions, using the arena as a cover. However, the last of these meetings ended tragically. An accidental explosion claimed several lives, and the participants disappeared as if they had never existed. Eric, realizing that the case was taking a threatening turn, gathered evidence and prepared an article for publication. But the day before the material was supposed to be published, a stranger called him. The voice on the other end of the line was hoarse and threatening. "You came too close, Eric. It's not worth writing about what lies behind the facade of the game." That evening, when Eric returned home, he found that the lock on his door had been broken. Upon entering, he realized that the apartment had been turned upside down. Among the clutter on the table was a note with the inscription, "Be silent, or you will be next." Adrenaline and fear took over Eric. He left the apartment and went to the office where his detective friend was staying. However, on the way, he noticed that he was being followed. A car without license plates drove slowly behind, maintaining a constant distance. Eric turned into an alley to try to get away from the pursuit, but they caught up with him. Two men in black uniforms got out of the car. "You're too curious for your own good, Stevens," one of them said with an icy grin. Eric felt the blood drain from his face. He knew these men weren't joking. His heart was pounding so hard that it seemed to be audible all over the alley. He turned abruptly and ran, ignoring the pain in his lungs, reminding himself of himself after a restless night. He knew that if he didn't hide, the consequences could be terrible. Stumbling, he ducked into a small passage between two old buildings. The weaving of the narrow streets resembled a maze, but Eric knew that every step brought him closer to safety. He couldn't afford to stop. Thoughts raced through his head that his article might have cost him his life. However, he could feel his pursuers not falling behind. The sound of footsteps behind him was getting closer. Eric came across a metal grate leading to the basement of one of the buildings. Realizing that he had no other choice, he quickly pushed back the lid and jumped inside, closing the grate behind him. It was dark and damp inside, but it didn't matter to him. He pressed himself against the wall, trying to stop breathing. The men stopped at the bars. One of them, loud and confident, said, "Stevens, come out and we won't hurt you. We just want you to leave this story alone. Trust me, you don't want to know who you're messing with." Eric froze, trying not to breathe. He could hear them talking among themselves, discussing where he might have gone. Suddenly one of them said, "We'll check all the exits. We won't let him live. We don't have time." Eric knew that his time was running out. He began to look around. In the basement there was only old furniture, rusty pipes, and a few boxes. Suddenly his gaze stopped on an old closet. He didn't know why it might be useful to him, but he decided to take a chance. Quickly running to the closet, he opened it and found that it contained old things covered with a layer of dust and cobwebs. His hands came across some heavy object. It was an old stick, probably metal. He took it and, concentrating all his strength, sat down behind the closet, preparing to meet strangers. If they found him, he wasn't going to give up without a fight. Gradually, the footsteps began to recede, and he heard one of them say, "He must have gone further. It's time to get out of here." Eric felt a surge of hope, but he knew that this was just a temporary reprieve. He knew he needed to get out of this basement and get back to his investigation before he could be found again. After a few minutes of silence, he carefully opened the closet door, looking out. Since no one was watching, Eric decided to act. He quickly and quietly got out of the basement, trying not to make a sound. Outside, he paused, listening to the sounds around him. The streets seemed calm, but he had to hurry. As he headed for the office, Eric realized that he was alone on this dangerous path. With his new information, his life was in danger, and he had to find out what kind of organization he had affected. But how to do this if the fear did not leave him at every step? He made it to his office, trying not to attract attention. Once inside, he headed for his desk. His notes are still open on the computer. Eric quickly began sorting through his data, trying to find more information about the mysterious people who he now knew were part of some hidden world. Soon he came across a reference to the Shadow Council, an organization that controlled various parts of the city using fear and force. Their riot control methods were brutal, and their connections to rent and private security agencies made them even more dangerous. Eric realized that he was part of something much more complicated than just an investigation. He realized that he had to tell his story, not only for his own sake, but also for the sake of those who could become the next victim. At that moment, he finally decided that he would not be silent. but his intentions to make the truth public were under threat. At night, when he was about to leave the office, the same stranger called him again. "You're still here, Eric. You don't realize how close you are to danger. I can help you, but you have to trust me." Eric sighed, realizing that this might be his only chance. He replied, "I'm ready to listen, but you have to tell me the truth." The stranger on the other end of the line hesitated. "Really? Do you want to know the truth? Okay, I'll tell you. But before we continue, listen to me carefully. You can't trust anyone, especially those who are looking for you now." Eric was wary. "Who are you? And why are you helping me?" "My name is Mark. I was part of the very security organization that you associate your investigations with. I left them when I saw what they were willing to go to for power. They arrange their affairs in secret, and you are the only one who is on the way to revealing the truth. I'll help you, but we have to meet, and I can't guarantee your safety until you figure out what you're dealing with." Eric sighed, hesitating. Every cell in his body screamed a warning. There are too many questions, too many risks. But he also knew that staying inactive was even more dangerous. He asked, "Where are you?" Mark made an appointment at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Eric knew it was risky, but he had no other choice. He had prepared several things: a phone to record the conversation, and a stick, just in case. As time passed, Eric realized that he had to act quickly. When he arrived at the place, he was overcome by silence. The building looked like an abandoned fortress. The windows were boarded up, the doors were open. Eric cautiously went inside, listening for every rustle. His heart was pounding in his chest as he moved deeper into the warehouse. Suddenly he saw a figure standing in the semi-darkness. It was Mark, a middle-aged man with a tired face and penetrating eyes. He looked like he had been through a lot. "Eric," he said, approaching. "You came. That's good, but we don't have much time." Eric quickly asked questions. "What do you know about the Shadow Council? Why are they so interested in stopping me?" Mark sighed, his face contorted with pain. "It's not just an organization, it's a network. They control almost everything in this city. Sports, politics, even some media. They do this to hold on to power. You've become a threat because they know you're close to the truth." Eric felt a chill run down his spine. "But how can I stop them?" Mark leaned closer. "You need to uncover their connections, but it's not easy. They have eyes everywhere. If you want to deal with them, you need to know their weaknesses. I can tell you about some of them, but you have to be careful." Eric was ready to listen, but before Mark could continue, there was a sharp sound. There was a loud crack, and footsteps sounded outside. "They've come for you," shouted Mark, grabbing Eric's arm. "Let's run." They rushed to the exit when Eric heard the voices of the pursuers. His heart was pounding in his chest, and adrenaline was filling him. Running out into the street, they jumped into a car that Mark had managed to park nearby. But alas, Eric soon realized that he could not trust Mark as much as anyone else. As they drove away, he noticed Mark nervously looking in the mirrors. Eric soon asked, "What happened?" "I do not know how they found out where you are," Mark said. "But we have to clean up all traces." There was alarm in his voice, and Eric sensed that something was wrong. He bent down to look through the window, and his heart skipped a beat. A black SUV with tinted windows was chasing them from behind. "It's them!" "Hold on!" shouted Mark, abruptly turning the corner. But the SUV was not far behind. He slowed down when they reached a quiet street where there was not a soul. Mark tried to evade his pursuers, but they were relentless. Eric, noticing how one of the men in the SUV got out and approached their car, shouted, "Mark, look!" Without waiting for an answer, Eric opened the door and ran out into the street. He understood that now, perhaps, this was his only chance of survival. Rushing into the alley, he felt the adrenaline rush over him again. He knew that there were screams and sounds of pursuit behind him, but right now he had only one thought: to get away from his pursuers. He ducked around the corner, then turned again and found himself in the shadows. Looking at the chase, he no longer thought about what he was doing. The only thought in his head was to get out and find out the truth. But suddenly he was caught. He ran into a group of people dressed in black uniforms. "Eric Stevens?" one of them asked with an icy grin. Eric knew this was the end. He was trapped in this dangerous world, and no one was going to save him. "You have the right to remain silent, but we have our own methods." Several men gathered around him, and Eric realized that he was in a complete hopeless situation. But then, when it seemed that hope was finally lost, Eric remembered what Mark had said: "You can't trust anyone." And maybe he still had a chance. He quickly turned around, preparing for a last attempt. The moment one of the men stepped forward, Eric, using all his strength, rushed at him, causing the others to be surprised. The whole situation turned into a serious fight. Eric fought like never before and, using his resourcefulness, managed to break free from their grip. Eventually, he broke out into the street, losing sight of them. It was getting dark, and Eric knew he needed to find shelter urgently. He understood that hiding wasn't enough. He had to find a way to expose them. Eric was on the move, looking forward, when a sense of determination gripped him. He knew that he had been looking for the truth all this time, but now she was looking for him. He was on the verge of a revelation that could change everything, and his story was just beginning. On the outskirts of a small town stood an abandoned house, old but not dilapidated, with an almost intact roof and dense, seemingly strong walls. People rarely walked here. The building had been empty for several years, and during that time rumors had grown. It was said that its previous owners, a married couple, had suddenly disappeared. The neighbors flatly refused to tell what exactly happened. All that we managed to find out came down to one thing. The house was built many years ago by an entrepreneur who decided to hide from the hustle and bustle of the city. Since then, he has gained notoriety. Everyone who appeared there too often stopped being the same. The townspeople called the house the Old Trap because those who entered it, even for a while, returned from there as strangers, as if they had left a part of themselves outside its threshold. There was something wrong in the house, and it was felt immediately. It was enough to see its windows pierced by time and fatigue, which seemed empty and motionless even on the sunniest day. Several students studying local history became interested in this building and decided to explore it, collecting material for a documentary project. They were ambitious and perhaps too confident in their abilities. Something in this strange story attracted them, forced them to put aside fear. The students prepared carefully. They took cameras, flashlights, notebooks with them, and spent more than one night reading archival materials to learn everything about the house. They managed to find old newspaper notes where scant lines mentioned mysterious disappearances and briefly described the family who lived here before the house was empty. That day they arrived at the house in the morning. It seemed to reduce the tension. There were 5 of them, and each in his own way was preparing internally for a meeting with the unknown. The house greeted them with a gloomy silence, as if it sensed that it was once again becoming the object of someone's attention. Along the way, the students discussed a plan: explore each room, record everything unusual, take notes, and look for any hint of the history of this place. By the time they reached the main entrance, the door of the house was closed. At first, none of them dared to enter. Standing at the massive door, they looked at each other, as if trying to read in each other's eyes who would have the courage to touch the cold metal handle first. In the end, one of them, Robert, the guy with the most experience in the field, gave a strangled laugh, hiding his nervousness, and opening the door, was the first to go inside. It was dark and quiet inside. Oddly enough, the smell was not what the guys expected. There was neither dampness nor mustiness characteristic of old buildings. Rather, it smelled of something detached and neutral, as if the house no longer belonged to this world. The rooms greeted them with emptiness. Wooden floors, cracked walls, slightly crumbled plaster, and a huge number of traces of their former life, which no one could return. The cabinets left by the owners have grown into their places, as if they were rooted to the floor and walls. In one of the rooms, the guys found old furniture, dusted with dust, but untouched by time, as if neither wind nor rain had ever entered this house. For the first hour, nothing remarkable happened. The students went from room to room, recording everything on camera, talking to each other, as if they wanted to stop shaking. The road led them to the farthest corner of the house, and then for the first time they felt something unnatural, a cold draft, although the windows and doors were closed. The room in the far corner was furnished a little differently. There was a wooden chair with faded armrests in the corner, and opposite it was a table on which someone had neatly laid out papers and several time-stained notebooks. Cautiously, as if afraid to disturb something invisible, the guys approached the table and began flipping through the pages. They were covered with small, nervous handwriting. Notes, dates, short and fragmentary phrases. One of them read, "Sometimes they come, but it's not clear why. The sound comes from below, as if someone drops something heavy. It's not a ghost, no. This is something else." In another note, there were words about night sounds, strange shadows on the walls, and the feeling that there was someone else in the house. At first, the students took it as ordinary diary entries, which could be the product of the shattered mind of the former owner. But with each new line, the feeling of fear, which at first only slightly shook their confidence, began to intensify. The third sheet looked different. The phrase was crossed out, and instead of words, deep, messy scratches remained on the paper, as if someone was trying to scratch something out. The deeper they flipped through the old pages, the more they got into the strange atmosphere of this house. One of the students, Alex, hesitated and raised his head, listening. The others, noticing his thoughtful look, immediately became alert. There was indeed a faint sound coming from behind the wall, as if from a far corner. It was not an obvious knock, but a barely discernible rustle, as if someone was carefully running his hands over the old wooden walls, not making himself felt. Alex pointed to the door leading to the basement, and everyone instinctively turned around, feeling that the basement could be the key to the mystery. The light reflected dimly from the walls, and each step of the students became more cautious. They all felt that something was wrong, but they could no longer retreat, no matter how much they wanted to. Each new sound seemed to demand their attention, dragging them deeper into what was happening. The students exchanged brief glances, trying to determine who would be the first to decide to go down to the basement. The basement looked old, and the stairs leading down seemed unreliable. In some places the steps creaked and caved in, exposing timbered boards. It was dark below, and even the faint light of their lanterns seemed to be lost before reaching the end of the stairs. However, Alex, the same student who first noticed the strange sounds, resolutely moved forward. Going downstairs, they found themselves in a small room where the walls and floor were damp, and the air was heavy and musty. Alex was the first to look around, pointing the flashlight at the faded walls. His beam picked out something in the far corner, some kind of old chest, covered with a layer of dust and cobwebs, as if it had not been opened for decades. It seemed to be an ordinary wooden chest, but its very surprise in this empty basement was striking. "What do you think, Rob?" Alex turned to his friend, as if asking for his permission, although in fact he was more waiting for support. Robert, careful and always serious, just shrugged his shoulders. They were here to find out what the house was hiding, and this chest could be the key. The others, no less excited than he was, watched every move. Alex lifted the lid of the chest with an effort. There was still a faint squeak in its hinges, but the lid gave way and the contents opened in front of them. Inside were several moldy books, several yellowed photographs, and a small metal box. The guys began to study the find. The books looked like old diaries, in which it was barely possible to make out the text. The photographs were also surprising. They depicted people, presumably the former owners of the house, although their faces looked tired and their eyes seemed detached, as if there was not a drop of life left in them. The pages in the diaries were soaked with moisture, and the text was partially blurred, but it was still possible to distinguish individual phrases. "They come every night," read the first entry, made with a trembling hand, "but I know they're not ghosts. It's them." None of the students could understand what these words meant, but the phrases became more and more disturbing. At some point, Robert noticed a metal box and, after hesitating, opened it. Inside was an old audio cassette, almost worn out and poorly preserved, but still intact. "We need to find a tape recorder," he said calmly, although his voice betrayed tension. Soon they brought a tape recorder, left by the owners, and inserted a cassette. The feed started with a barely audible hum. At first it was just noise, booming static, as if someone was tuning up a radio, but then snatches of voices appeared against the background of the noise. "I know we're not alone here," said a voice, barely distinguishable, but audible in the dark. "It's not just a house, it's a trap." The recording stopped, leaving the students in silence. They were silent, absorbing what they had heard. There were more questions than answers, and this uncertainty weighed on everyone. After a short pause, Robert suggested continuing the research, but the others were clearly getting nervous. One of the girls, Julia, felt that something was wrong in the house, that it harbored a secret that was better left alone. But it was already difficult to retreat. The guys continued to search, because they understood that if they left now, all the preparation and work would be useless. They went back up to the ground floor, trying to explore the rooms they hadn't explored yet, while Julia tried to keep her composure. They were moving slowly and carefully now. The atmosphere of the house, which had previously seemed just strange, now seemed to thicken, heating up with every step. When they reached one of the back rooms, they came across a door that for some reason they had not noticed before. This door, unlike the others, was locked from the inside, and no one knew what might be there. At first, Robert tried to open it with a hairpin, but the lock wouldn't budge. Then Alex, succumbing to curiosity, brought a heavy object and hit the door. The lock gave up, and it opened. There was a small room behind the door, almost empty except for an old desk and a pile of papers on it. The sheets looked chaotic. Many of them were torn, as if someone had torn them in a fit of rage. On one of the sheets, the words were legibly written, "If you're here, it's too late." This house changes people. There was something sinister about it, but at the same time the students saw it as a chance to find out the truth. The papers contained notes about what was happening in the house, about certain people coming and going, but disappearing without a trace. On another page, Robert noticed a drawing, a schematic plan of the house, on which one place was marked with a cross. It was located outside the main building, somewhere in the backyard. Everyone immediately paid attention to this plan, realizing that this might be their chance to solve the mystery. The students wasted no time leaving the house and heading to the place indicated on the diagram. There was a clear trace of excavation in the ground, but fresh. Someone recently opened up the ground in this place, and it immediately aroused suspicion. The guys started digging, and soon came across an old wooden lid leading to a dungeon that they did not even know about. When they lifted the lid, a pungent smell of dampness and something else, unpleasant and disturbing, escaped into the air. The dungeon looked like an abandoned bunker, low ceiling, narrow corridors, and a few old, mildewed objects. They cautiously began to explore this space, feeling uncomfortable. At the far end of the dungeon, they found another chest, but this time there were documents, photos, and records of people who once visited the house inside. Apparently, everyone who entered here disappeared, leaving only mentions of themselves. The documents contained dates, lists, and several letters mentioning people who allegedly disappeared without a trace. Shuddering with horror, the students silently examined the documents they found. Every paper confirmed their worst suspicions. People who entered the house disappeared without a trace, as if they were swallowed up by the very darkness of the place. There were more and more questions, but the main one was, would they be able to get out of here alive? Realizing that the situation could be dangerous, Robert was the first to suggest leaving the dungeon. The others, being no less scared, readily agreed. They began to move back towards the exit, and had almost reached the stairs when there was a sharp sound behind them, as if someone had closed the hatch through which they had entered. Turning around, they saw with horror that the exit was blocked. Someone or something locked them inside. Panic gripped each of them. Robert was the first to rush to the hatch, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The others helped him by hitting the tree, shouting and calling for help, but all in vain. In desperation, Julia began banging her fists on the lid while Alex tried to find another way to escape. But the dungeon was cramped, and the walls seemed to shrink around them, depriving them of their last strength. Once trapped, the students began to realize the full horror of their situation. They were in the heart of an abandoned house, in a closed dungeon where other people had once disappeared. They had no food or water, their flashlights were dimming, and the air was getting heavier by the minute. A day passed, then the second. Their voices faded, their breathing became ragged. They were still trying to get out, but they had almost given up hope. Their strength was fading, and everyone realized that there was practically no chance of salvation left. They began to write down their last thoughts on the sheets they found. Desperate words of hope and farewell, last confessions and regrets. And in the end, silence enveloped the dungeon again, engulfing them forever. When, a few months later, the city services finally decided to inspect the abandoned building, no one suspected what kind of secret it was hiding. They found a locked hatch, and under it, the remains of young people, the last traces of which were recorded on paper lying next to their bodies. So ended the story of those who decided to penetrate where the horror was hiding. Autumn has always been a special time in a small town. People were preparing for Halloween in advance. Every house was decorated with cobwebs and pumpkins. Children ran around the streets in costumes, and adults organized parties and contests. In this city, Halloween was almost the main event of the year, and every resident tried to participate, as if this was their secret pride. The hero of this story was a young man named Zach. He was 22. And over the past few years he had found a hobby in conducting quests and scary pranks for his friends and neighbors. Every year he planned a new game, thinking through every element of it to impress everyone. Zach was famous for the fact that his every quest was not only scary, but also unbearably realistic, and every year his participants left the party with tension and adrenaline. This year was no exception. Zach decided that his last idea was to create a quest that everyone who decides to participate will remember. He sent out invitations to friends, describing in detail that this time the quest will be different from the previous ones and will require courage and endurance from the participants. Zach created a whole concept. The quest was called The Silence of the City. The participants had to go around several themed locations throughout the city, from an old motel to a small abandoned warehouse, where terrible surprises await them. This time, Zach wanted not only his friends to take part in the game, but also several local guys who would not normally be among his acquaintances. It was said that such tournaments are organized according to special rules, and in order to gain access to the game, you need to know passwords or find special signs indicating caches where clues are hidden. Zach was well aware that the project needed to be approached with extreme care. He checked every detail, inspected the selected locations, and even spent several days learning how to enhance the effects of fear. According to the idea of the quest, the participants had to go through the locations alone, without the right to outside help. At each stage, a new fear awaited them, which had to be overcome. Zach called it a fortitude test, but friends joked that he just wanted to see which one of them would shout first. This Halloween, however, the city was gripped by some tension. A few weeks ago, reports of strange cases appeared in the news. 2 young people disappeared after a walk in the evening. A suitcase with personal belongings was found abandoned by someone in the forest, and suspicious lights were seen near the lake for several days in a row. No one knew what was going on, but residents tried not to focus on it, and the city administration convinced everyone that there was no reason to worry. Nevertheless, these events did not pass by the plans of the law. He immediately realized that he could use the atmosphere of mystery surrounding the disappearances to create an even more frightening quest. He made contact with the owner of the motel, who agreed to open an old abandoned wing of the building, long closed to visitors, where, according to rumors, several unexplained incidents once occurred. The motel was located on the outskirts of the city, next to the forest, and was known for its frightening corridors and rooms, each of which contained elements from past eras. Zakovo's quest plan became even more daring. He set up locations so that the path passed through the most sinister and deserted parts of the city. The first place is a dilapidated barn on the outskirts. This place has long caused unpleasant feelings among the locals, but no one knew the exact history of its creation. Zack had prepared traps and hints there that would lead the players to the next point. Each place was full of carefully selected details. For example, in one of the rooms of the old motel, he placed a mirror with the inscription "Daredevil will find a way out" and artificial bloodstains on the floor. Halloween night finally arrived. Everyone who was invited to the game gathered, and they discussed the terms of participation with interest. Zack, wearing a mask and a dark suit, gave out instructions, and then lit candles in each of the rooms he had prepared, enhancing the atmosphere. He reminded the participants of the main rule. It is impossible to leave the territory of the quest. The game will start exactly at midnight, and anyone who for some reason decides to leave the game earlier will have to reach a special gathering point near the forest border. Linda was the first to approach the location. She was one of Zack's best friends, but this time she was overcome by a strange feeling of fear. Zack told her to go to the old barn, where a note was waiting for her, which indicated the further route. It was dusk in the barn. Small dust particles hung from the ceiling from the wind, and everything reminded of old abandoned buildings. Linda stepped forward, feeling the cold creep under her clothes, and saw the first task. She had to open an iron box with a key, which, according to Zack, was on the other side of the world, or rather, in an old motel. Linda moved through the dark corridors of the motel, her skin crawling with every sound. Finally, she reached the room where the key was supposed to be. As soon as she entered, the door slammed shut behind her and the lights went out. Linda's pulse sped up, but she knew it was part of the game. A dim light flashed ahead. It was a small lamp on the floor, illuminating a small piece of paper on which was written, "You see what you want to see. Just don't open the door until you hear footsteps." The next was Nick, who always tried to appear brave, but deep down he was afraid of such quests. He was directed to the basement, and as he moved there, he clutched his phone in his hands, the light of which was the only source of illumination. Suddenly, he saw an image of a human palm painted with fresh paint on the wall. There was another note on the floor: "You've reached the final. Open the drawer and read what's hidden inside." When he opened the drawer, he found a photo of Linda inside. From the very room she had entered a minute ago, Nick stared intently at the photograph. It showed Linda standing in the middle of that motel room, facing the door, but her face was tense, as if she had noticed something disturbing. Nick was trying to figure out where this photo could have come from when he heard a strange sound coming from behind the closed basement door. At first it seemed to him like muffled breathing, then there was a crackling sound, as if someone was scratching the door from the other side. Realizing that something had gone wrong, Nick tried to remember if Zack had mentioned anything like that in his instructions. "It's just a prank," Nick told himself, hoping that Zack was just trying to amplify the effects of fear. But when the sound of scratching got closer and the door began to slowly open, Nick panicked and tried to get out through the other side of the basement, but he lit up only one corner. There was no way out. All he could do was hide behind an old closet and hope that he wouldn't be noticed. At the same time, Linda realized that something was wrong with the quest when she discovered that the door in her room was locked, and attempts to open it did not give any result. She exhaled, hoping that this was just part of the game, but after spending 15 minutes waiting, she began to panic. She had the feeling that someone was watching her. When she sat down with her head in her hands, she noticed another note under the bed. "You will lose if you leave this room." Not knowing what to do next, Linda was startled by an unexpected sound. In the far corner of the room, a faint light appeared from somewhere in the wall, like a beam from a flashlight. She started walking towards him, but as she got closer, she felt something cold on her neck. It was air from a crack in the wall. Her palms were sweating, but she tried to reach for the light source when she heard a barely audible whisper. "You know you shouldn't be here." Nick and Linda realized that they could not leave their locations. They started randomly hitting the walls and calling for help, but no one seemed to hear them. Zach, meanwhile, stood outside and watched the rest of the participants, who also began to suspect something was wrong. They were trying to figure out where Nick and Linda had gone, because according to the plan they were supposed to meet in a few minutes at a common gathering point. But time passed and no one appeared. Zach, hearing from someone that screams were coming from the motel, hurried to the building. As soon as he opened the front door, he found that the lobby was immersed in an unusual semi-darkness, and no lights were working. He went to the basement, where he thought Nick might be, and noticed on the floor the same photos that Nick had found earlier. Only now there were other participants in the game, filmed in the last moments before disappearing. Zach walked out of the basement into the cold night air, looking around, hoping that this was someone's prank, but he had the feeling that someone was following him. Zach could feel cold sweat forming on his forehead as he walked out of the basement and looked around again. The atmosphere around him was frightening. The dark streets unlit by a single lamp, the sounds of the night seemed excessively loud, as if they were being listened to not only by him, but also by someone else. Thoughts were spinning in my head that the quest had not gone according to plan, and what he and his friends were arranging had crossed the line beyond which there was no return. He returned to the motel, where panic began among the remaining participants. Some had already started shouting, calling for people, but Zach knew that it was all part of the game. He wanted everything to be really scary, but not so that people would disappear. He couldn't figure out what was going on. He searched the rooms and corridors, but found no traces that would explain the disappearance of Nick and Linda. On a shelf in one of the corridors, he noticed a black bag that had not been there before. It stood slightly ajar, as if someone had forgotten it. Zach went over and opened it. Inside there were a couple of photos showing people dressed in costumes who were definitely not participants in his game. These faces are not familiar, but the expressions on them, the look on the pictures was the same: confusion and fear. Zach felt his heart begin to beat faster. "What the hell is going on?" he whispered to himself as footsteps sounded in the hallway. He looked up, expecting to see one of his friends, but a stranger was standing in front of him. A man in his 40s, with a pale face and dressed in a dark coat that was completely out of place. He stood motionless, just looking at Zach. The man's gaze was cold and calculating. Zach couldn't figure out how he got here, but feeling something alarming, he took a step back, but his movement stopped. "You still don't understand what you started?" The stranger's voice was low but strong, as if the man knew what was going to happen to them next. Zach couldn't answer, and then the stranger turned around and disappeared around the corner. Zach didn't know what to do. Fear held him down, but he needed to find his friends and bring them back, even though he was already beginning to suspect that this had all gone too far. He ran to the basement, but when he opened the doors, he found himself in some place that he did not remember. There was no staircase, and instead there was an old spiral staircase creaking under his feet. Everything was dark around, but when Zach came down, he saw that the walls of the hall were covered not just with dirt, but with some strange liquid that looked like blood. There were objects on the floor that were familiar to him. Old suits, fragments of clothes. All this created a strange feeling as if other people had once been here. Maybe they were looking for a way out, but they didn't find it. Zach started to turn around in panic, hearing strange sounds in the distance. He noticed that someone was moving in the shadows ahead, but they weren't his friends. Zach tried to approach, but his footsteps echoed on the walls, and suddenly all the lights in the room went out. He cried out in surprise, but there was no response to his cry. With each passing moment, it became more and more obvious to him that something was wrong here. He didn't have time or opportunity to think when he heard the noise behind him again. He turned around and for a moment met the eyes of the man in the black coat who had disappeared around the corner. The man did not move. His face remained invisible in the darkness, but there was such fury in his eyes that Zack could not understand whether it was true or fear that made his imagination draw these scenes. When Zack tried to move again, he was stopped by a note that was tied to the wall at eye level. He took it off, and on a piece of paper it was written, "You realized too late where you were going." These words made his heart freeze. Zack was sure it was part of the game, but the tension in the air left no room for doubt. Something didn't add up here. In a panic, he ran again, hoping to find a way out, but the faster he moved, the more he felt like he was being chased. And although this fear was not new to him, he now felt not just anxiety, but real danger. Zack turned around and, taking a deep breath, rushed to the next staircase, which led to the exit to the street. He had almost reached the door, but at that moment he heard footsteps approaching from behind. Zack opens the door and sees Linda. She looked as if she had just returned from some scary place. Her eyes were clouded, and there were indistinct marks on her hands. Linda stood silently, as if nothing had happened, but her gaze was frightening. At that moment, Zack realized that someone was manipulating their game. Someone who knew more than they did. Zack continued to wander through the dark corridors of the motel, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't figure out what was going on. Everything looked as if someone had decided to bring horror to his own quest. But one thought nagged at me. It was all too real, too terrible to be just part of the game. As he moved on, his gaze fell back on those photos. Each of them was now distorted, as if they depicted not just moments, but desperate faces of people who already realized that the game was out of control. Zack held up one of the photos, which showed Linda with her eyes full of fear. It wasn't just a photo. It was a recording of the moment of her disappearance. At some point, a figure appeared around the corner. Zack felt something cold creep up his neck. He froze, realizing that this was not one of the participants in the quest. It was someone else, someone who shouldn't be here. The footsteps became louder, and now, a man in a dark suit appeared in front of him, whose face was hidden by a mask, but his eyes sparkled with a bright, ominous light. He was standing right in front of Zack, and in his hands was the same knife that Zack had used in previous quests to create fear effects. "You still don't understand," the man said, and his voice sounded like an echo, as if he had said it more than once. "You thought it was just a game. And now you realize that this is not a quest, but a trap." Zack stepped back, but it was too late. He felt the cold of the metal as the knife stabbed into his stomach. A sharp pain shot through his body, and he fell to the floor of the motel, not believing what was happening. And then, with every passing moment, the picture became clearer. Whoever was standing in front of him was not just a part of the game. It was someone who had been watching him for a long time, who had long known about his passion for quests, and who realized that his passion for intimidation could be used in real life. Zack struggled to his feet, and his eyes filled with a panicked realization. His whole game was rigged against him. It wasn't an accident. Everything was planned. He became part of his own game, but not on the terms he expected. His gaze swept over the motel, and he realized that at the moment when he conceived the quest, he had already played someone else's game, a game where he was not the leader, but the victim. When Zack lost consciousness, the only thing he managed to see was a figure disappearing into the darkness, and the very knife he had once used lying next to him on the floor.